The aim of Eisenhower's new look in defense was to reconcile the conflicting demands of the military, which wanted to spend more money, with those of the Treasury, which wanted to spend less money. Eisenhower believed that U.S. power depended on economic success rather than weaponry, and that it was not wise to continue military spending at the Truman administration's cost, which was $50 billion per year, because this would lead to inflation and economic ruin. Eisenhower wanted more bang for a buck. Greater dependence on nuclear weaponry would save the United States money and protect it as effectively as conventional forces. Eisenhower then reduced the size of the Army and the Navy. Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, made a speech that said the United States would use massive retaliatory power to halt aggression, which resulted in the idea of brinkmanship, the willingness to go to the brink of full-scale war to force the other side to back down. The new look applied. In Vietnam, Eisenhower's policy of massive retaliation was first tested when he considered using nuclear power to help the French, but eventually he decided against it. Quemoy and Matsu are islands in the Taiwan Straits between Mao Zedong's Communist China and Chiang Kai-shek's island of Taiwan. This was another test for Eisenhower's policy of massive retaliation. Communist China shelled nationalist troops on the island of Quemoy because they pledged to liberate Taiwan. Eisenhower would not allow a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, but would not bomb the mainland as requested. Eisenhower was accused by Democrat Adlai Stevenson for risking a Third World War over these islands. As you can see from this map, the islands of Quemoy and Matsu are relatively small and much closer to mainland China than Taiwan. Assessment of massive retaliation. Critics said that massive retaliation was inflexible and left the United States with only one option in a crisis. Supporters said that the United States' threat of massive retaliation meant that there would be no crises. Eisenhower's change in foreign policy. Truman had wanted to end the Korean War, but Eisenhower brought about change by actually ending it. The end of the Korean War was still brought no change in the hostile relations between the United States, Communist China, and the USSR. The Eisenhower administration was unresponsive when Stalin died and when the new Soviet leader sought détente, mostly because of fears of McCarthy's reaction. Republicans in 1952 started to talk of a new policy called rollback, pushing back communism in places where it has already been established. However, the Eisenhower administration did nothing against Soviet domination in East Europe. Therefore, Eisenhower was just continuing Truman's policy of containment in Europe. A new look for United States-Canadian relations. During Eisenhower's presidency, the USSR developed long-range bombers that would likely be routed across Canada to reach the United States. NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, was established to facilitate U.S. interception of Soviet bombers or missiles over Canada. NORAD has an American commander and a Canadian deputy commander. The establishment of NORAD is evidence that the Cold War drew the United States and Canada closer in diplomatic and military terms. A new world in the Eisenhower era. In the Eisenhower years, there were nationalist and independence movements that aimed to sweep the colonial powers out of Africa and Asia, and a movement in Cuba, right in the United States' backyard. Eisenhower tried to resist left-wing reformist movements in Asia, Vietnam, in the Middle East and Iran, and in Latin America, in Cuba and Guatemala. In Latin America, the use of covert operations was used as a new method of resistance. Covert operations were undercover CIA missions that infiltrated governments that were leaning towards communism or socialism and supported their overthrow. This led to resentment in Latin American nations towards the United States. This is a graphic to summarize what was new and not new during the Eisenhower administration and with Eisenhower's foreign policy.
The transition from the Truman administration to the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower claimed that the Truman administration had neglected Latin American countries as the USA was too preoccupied with Europe and Asia. Eisenhower argued that by ignoring Latin America, the region fell into terrible disillusionment and became vulnerable to communism. Eisenhower suggested that he would pursue a more constructive policy in Latin America. The U.S. perspective, sympathy to hostility. Americans were generally sympathetic toward revolutionaries. However, the USA's concern for stability in trading partners and fears of communism combined to make the USA deeply suspicious of revolution. As Eisenhower had just got troops out of Korea, he did not want to get involved in another war, but he did want to take some sort of action in Latin America. Dealing with the revolutionaries. Eisenhower wanted to avoid war, so he used other means to deal with the revolutionaries he disliked. Eisenhower sent U.S. military advisors to assist friendly regimes in training native troops to oppose revolutionaries, as he had done in Vietnam. Eisenhower bought off Bolivian revolutionaries, and the CIA used covert operations against the Guatemalan regime, and an operation against the Cuban Revolution was being planned in the final months of Eisenhower's presidency. A covert operation is defined as a military operation that's intended to conceal the identity of or allow plausible denial by the sponsor or, in some cases, the government. Revolutionary potential in Latin America. Dulles feared that the poverty and inequality in wealth in Latin America could lead to a communist revolution. Aside from Costa Rica and Mexico, only 2% of the population owned around 70% of the agricultural land. As a result, many poor peasants were leaving big cities and congregating in shanty towns. A shanty town is a collection of poorly built dwellings containing poverty-stricken populations. The image on the slide is a shanty town located in Colombia. The Eisenhower administration felt that strongmen were the best guarantee of internal stability. Eisenhower did not even consider giving Latin American nations economic aid as Truman had done with Europe through the Marshall Plan. While private American investment in Latin America was $1.4 billion from 1953 to 1957, it was about $3.4 billion in Western Europe. A strongman is defined as a dictator, typically in Latin America. Eisenhower covert operations in Guatemala. Most Guatemalans were poor, illiterate Indians who farmed the lands of the whites and mestizos. The United Fruit Company exploited the inequality between the white/mestizos and the natives. The United Fruit Company paid minimal taxes, had domination over Guatemalan port facilities, and paid employees exceptionally low wages. Arevalo, Arbenz, and Guatemalan reform. In 1944, student riots and a disgruntled professional middle class prompted a liberal revolution led by philosophy professor Juan José Arevalo. In the 1950 election, Arevalo supported the candidacy of Jacoby Arbenz Guzman. Arbenz was supported by the Guatemalan Communist Party, and he expropriated unused land and distributed it to peasants. He took around 15% of the unused acres belonging to the United Fruit Company. Expropriation is defined as taking possession of without compensation. Arbenz offered to pay the United Fruit Company the $600,000 it claimed the land was worth on its tax return. United Fruit had undervalued the land and, when faced with the offer of $600,000, claimed the land was actually worth $16 million. The company wanted the help of the U.S. government, so they declared that Arbenz was a communist. As a result, the U.S. demanded that Arbenz pay the $16 million, and when Arbenz refused, Eisenhower moved to isolate Guatemala and overthrow Arbenz. The significance of the overthrow of Arbenz. The United States' decision to overthrow Arbenz demonstrated how they would prefer an unliked strongman opposed to a communist. The overthrow led to the alienation and disconnect in Guatemala and across Latin America. The Bolivian Revolution. In 1952, revolutionaries nationalized tin mining and radical land reform. The U.S. didn't stop the revolution because the revolutionaries weren't communists, they were more so fascists. Similarly, the U.S. had few investments in Bolivia. As a result, the U.S. just sent foreign aid, which was a much less aggressive approach. Vice President Nixon's Latin American visits. The aim of Nixon's visit in Argentina was to show U.S. support for the elected leader Arturo Frondizi. Similarly, the U.S. wanted to reassure nations they were respected and the U.S. wasn't taking them for granted. Soviets were making trade agreements with Argentina and Chile, which prompted the U.S. to take action in Latin America. Results and significance of Nixon's visits. Nixon considered the visit a triumph as it displayed U.S. courage. However, U.S. viewed events through a Cold War lens. They blamed communists for anti-American demonstrations and failed to see that some non-communists simply disliked the United States. Visits did not improve relations, as Nixon missed some of Frondizi's inauguration, and Nixon was met with violent protests in both Peru and Venezuela. Eisenhower and the OPA. The OPA is defined as the Operation Pan America, which was centered on low-interest loans from the United States. In 1956, Eisenhower met with Latin American leaders in Panama. He endorsed the OPA in public but privately resented financial demands. For example, Brazil wanted $3 billion. However, the OPA's demands were feasible for the U.S.'s national budget.